The gathering storm, the war had been burning for 12 years, and still, no one could remember why it started. Admiral Sirik stood on the command deck of the Dravok dreadnought Eternal Resolve, watching another frigate explode on the tactical display. The ship had contained 400 souls, now reduced to glowing particles scattered across the void. He felt the weight of each loss pressing down on his shoulders like stones in a burial cairn. 12 years of this madness, 12 years of killing and dying, and for what? Territory that would be worthless rubble by the time either side claimed it? Pride that had long since curdled into bitter ash? The Dravok Empire had once been a beacon of culture and philosophy. Their crystalline cities had housed the greatest libraries in 3 sectors. Their universities had drawn students from 100 worlds, and their poets had written verses that made even the most hardened warriors weep. Now those cities lay in ruins, the libraries burned, the universities empty. The poets had all gone to war, and if they still wrote verses, they were epitaphs across the battlefield, separated by thousands of kilometers of deadly space. Commander Valen of the Kelthrian Union stood in her own command chamber aboard the war cruiser Defiant Spirit. She was younger than Sarix by 2 decades, but the war had aged her beyond her years. Her silver hair, once a mark of distinction among her people, had dulled to the color of spent ash. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with curiosity and joy, now held only a weary determination. The Kelthrian Union had been explorers and traders, their merchant fleets connecting distant worlds in webs of commerce and culture. They had built spaceports that became melting pots of galactic civilization, where beings from countless species mingled and shared ideas. Their diplomats had resolved conflicts. Their mediators had prevented wars. Their traders had built bridges between alien minds. Now their fleets carried weapons instead of goods. Their diplomats had become generals, and their bridges led only to battlefields. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula raged around both commanders with a fury that would have seemed impossible in the early days of the war. Back then, there had been rules of engagement, concepts of honor, limits on what weapons could be used and where. Those restraints had eroded year by year, battle by battle, atrocity by atrocity. Now there were no rules except survival, no honor except victory, no limits except those imposed by the imagination of weapons designers who had long since stopped sleeping at night. Sarix watched as another wave of Kelthrian fighters swept toward his formation. His tactical officer called out targeting solutions with mechanical precision, as if the numbers represented abstract problems rather than living beings about to die. He gave the order to fire, and the void lit up with energy weapons that could boil a lake in seconds. 18 fighters vanished. 18 pilots who had families, dreams, fears, and hopes, gone in flashes of light that would reach distant stars thousands of years from now, long after everyone who had fought here was forgotten. Valen saw the counterattack coming and maneuvered her forces to absorb the blow. She lost a destroyer and 2 corvettes along with 800 crew members who had trusted her to bring them home. She had stopped making promises like that 5 years ago. Now she only promised to make their deaths mean something, though even that was becoming harder to believe. On the Galactic Senate station called Unity's Promise, representatives from 200 species watched the battle unfold through sensor feeds and felt their carefully constructed civilization crumbling. The Senate had been formed 3 centuries ago to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic war. They had created laws, established courts, built peacekeeping forces, and crafted treaties that were supposed to make large-scale conflict impossible. For 287 years, the system had worked. Then the Dravok and Kelthrians had gone to war, and all those careful structures had proven as substantial as morning mist. Ambassador Terran of the Marine Traders Guild addressed the Senate chamber with a desperation that bordered on panic. Her people were merchants who operated hundreds of trading posts throughout the conflict zone. They had tried to remain neutral, but neutrality was a luxury neither side could afford to respect. Dravok forces seized marine ships suspected of carrying supplies to Kelthrian worlds. Kelthrian raiders destroyed marine stations accused of refueling Dravok vessels. In 12 years, the Marine had lost 60% of their commercial infrastructure and hundreds of thousands of lives. The Yoltan colonists had suffered even worse. Their agricultural worlds lay directly in the path of the advancing armies, and neither side showed any interest in protecting civilian settlements when military necessity demanded otherwise. Entire planets had been abandoned, their populations fleeing in whatever ships they could find. Millions of refugees drifted through space unwelcome in every port, slowly dying of starvation and disease while the great powers fought over the ruins of their homes. The Senate debated and argued and passed resolutions that no one enforced. They sent peacekeeping forces that were either ignored or destroyed. They offered mediation that both sides rejected. They threatened sanctions that had no teeth. They were a government without power, a court without authority, witnesses to an apocalypse they could not prevent. Chancellor Morveth, who had led the Senate for 40 years, stood before the assembly and spoke words that everyone knew were true, but no one wanted to hear. The galactic order was collapsing. The systems that had maintained peace for centuries were failing. If the war continued, it would spread. Already, smaller conflicts were erupting in other sectors as various species decided that if the great powers could ignore the law, so could they. Violence was metastasizing across the galaxy like a cancer, and they had no cure. Back at the Crimson Nebula, the battle reached a terrible crescendo. Syrinx had received new orders from the Dravok High Command, orders that made his blood run cold even after 12 years of horror. They had developed a new weapon, something called a quantum disruptor. The scientists who created it had explained the theory with obvious pride, but all Syrinx understood was the result. The weapon would tear apart the quantum bonds that held matter together. Anything caught in its field would simply cease to exist, not destroyed but unmade, erased from reality as if it had never been. The High Command wanted him to use it on the Kelthrian fleet. Not just the military vessels, but everything. The supply ships, the medical frigates, the engineering platforms, the courier boats. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of lives gone in an instant. It would be the single largest act of destruction in the entire war, and the High Command believed it would finally break the Kelthrian will to fight. Syrinx held the authorization codes in his hand and stared at them as if they were poisonous serpents. He had killed many people during this war. He had ordered attacks on military targets that he knew would have civilian casualties. He had made the hard choices that commanders must make when nations collide. But this was different. This was not war, it was extermination. This was not military necessity, it was genocide. This was the moment where he would either remain a soldier or become a monster. Valen, meanwhile, had received her own terrible orders. Kelthrian intelligence had located the primary Dravok shipyards at Forge Station 9, a massive orbital complex that produced half of the Empire's warships. The station was located above an inhabited planet, with a population of 2 billion civilians. The Kelthrian Union wanted her to destroy the station using planet-killer weapons, massive kinetic impactors that would punch through the station and continue down to the planet's surface, triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that would render the world uninhabitable for centuries. The military justification was sound. Destroying Forge Station 9 would cripple Dravok ship production and potentially shorten the war by years. The civilian cost was catastrophic, but the Union's Strategic Command argued that millions of deaths now might prevent billions of deaths later. They presented their calculations, their projections, their cold mathematical certainty that this atrocity was the lesser evil. Valen looked at the authorization and wondered if the beings who had written it still had souls, or if the war had burned those away years ago. She wondered if she still had a soul, or if it had died along with all the other things she had lost. She wondered if anyone would remember them kindly after this was over, or if history would record them all as butchers who had drowned the galaxy in blood for reasons no one could quite recall. As both commanders wrestled with their conscience, their fleets continued to kill each other with almost casual efficiency. The weapons they had used for years were terrible enough, but everyone knew these new horrors were coming. The war was entering a new phase, a final phase where restraint would be abandoned and survival would become the only remaining goal. Syrinx made a decision then that he would question for the rest of his life. Perhaps it was frustration at being lectured by an outsider. Perhaps it was fear that his resolve to use the quantum disruptor was weakening. Perhaps it was simply that after 12 years of war, the idea of backing down from anyone, even mysterious humans and impossible ships, was intolerable. He gave the order to fire a warning shot. A single plasma torpedo aimed to pass within 100 meters of the human ship. The torpedo never reached its target. It simply ceased to exist approximately halfway to the horizon's edge, winking out as if someone had erased it from reality. No explosion, no energy discharge, just gone. Valen, watching this display, felt a chill run down her spine. That should not have been possible. Point defense systems could destroy incoming weapons, but this was different. The torpedo had not been destroyed, it had been negated, cancelled, unmade. That required technology far beyond anything the Kelthrian Union or Dravok Empire possessed. Captain Vasquez spoke again, and now her voice was cold as the void between stars. That was your one warning. The next demonstration will be more comprehensive. I say again, cease fire and withdraw to neutral positions or face the consequences. Syrinx felt his pride warring with his survival instinct. The Dravok Empire did not back down from threats, had never surrendered to intimidation, had built their civilization on the principle that strength was the only currency that mattered in the galaxy. But something about this situation felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. The horizon's edge sat in space like a predator playing with prey, utterly confident and completely calm. He made another decision, perhaps his final mistake or possibly the first wise choice he had made in years. All ships maintain formation but cease fire. I want full sensor analysis of that human vessel. Find me a weakness. Valen gave similar orders to her fleet, and for a brief moment the battle paused. Both sides turned their sensors toward the horizon's edge, scanning it with every instrument they possessed, looking for the vulnerabilities that every ship must have. Power sources, weapon systems, engine configurations, shield generators, anything that might tell them how to fight this strange intruder. The sensors returned data that made no sense. The ship appeared to be generating power outputs that should require a reactor the size of a small moon. Its hull material was unidentifiable, seeming to shift and change under analysis as if it existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously. Most disturbing, it appeared to be generating some kind of field that extended for thousands of kilometers in all directions, an invisible bubble whose purpose was unclear, but whose power readings were astronomical. Captain Vasquez's voice cut through the confusion with terrible finality. You have had your warning. You have had your time to choose wisdom. Since you persist in violence, I will show you what you face. What happened next would be analyzed by scientists and military theorists for generations, though no one would ever fully understand it. The horizon's edge did not fire weapons in any conventional sense. It did not launch missiles or emit energy beams. Instead, the field it had been generating suddenly pulsed outward in a wave that passed through both fleets in less than a second. And when the wave passed, every weapon in both fleets simply stopped working. Not destroyed, not damaged, just inactive. Plasma cannons would not charge. Missile tubes would not open. Energy weapons failed to generate beams. Point defense systems went dark. The quantum disruptor that Syrinx had been preparing to use reported complete system failure across every subsystem simultaneously. The planet-killer weapons Valen had been authorized to deploy showed no response to any command input. 300 Dravok warships and 280 Kelthrian vessels suddenly found themselves floating in space with all the offensive capability of cargo haulers. Their shields still functioned, their engines still worked. Their life support remained active, but every system designed to kill had been neutralized, turned off as casually as someone might flip a light switch. The silence that followed was profound. Thousands of military personnel stared at their control panels in disbelief. Admirals and commanders checked and rechecked their systems, hoping for malfunctions, praying for glitches, anything except the terrible truth that was becoming undeniable. A single human ship had disarmed 2 entire battle fleets without firing a shot, without destroying a single vessel, with a technology that seemed almost magical in its casual omnipotence. Captain Vasquez's voice returned, and now there was something almost sad in it. For 50 years we watched you. We saw your councils and your treaties, your laws and your civilization. We saw you build something beautiful, something we hoped might endure. And then we watched you tear it all down in 12 years of pointless slaughter. We debated for a long time whether to intervene, whether you deserved to be saved from yourselves. She paused, and in that pause, every person in both fleets understood they were not dealing with the humanity that had left the Galactic Senate 50 years ago. That civilization had been impressive but not overwhelming. This was something else. Something that had spent half a century in isolation becoming something greater and stranger and more powerful than anyone had imagined possible. We decided, Vasquez continued, that you deserve a chance. Just one. Both fleets will withdraw to neutral positions immediately. You will each send a single representative to the horizon's edge for peace negotiations. You will negotiate in good faith, or I will ensure that neither side ever has the capacity to make war again. Am I understood? Syrinx looked at his tactical display, at his fleet of warships that were now nothing more than expensive scrap metal floating in formation. He looked at the authorization codes for the quantum disruptor that would never function again. He looked at 12 years of war and sacrifice and death, and he wondered if any of it had ever mattered at all. Understood, he said quietly. Velan, in her own command chamber, felt something she had not experienced in years. It might have been relief, or it might have been despair, or perhaps both at once. We comply, she transmitted. Within hours, both fleets had withdrawn to opposite sides of the system. The civilian transports, those that had survived, were allowed to leave, escorted by human vessels that appeared from nowhere to guide them to safety. Admiral Syrinx and Commander Velan found themselves aboard shuttles, heading toward the horizon's edge, about to meet face-to-face for the first time despite spending 12 years trying to kill each other. The negotiations lasted 6 days. Captain Vasquez did not dictate terms or demand surrender. Instead, she asked questions. Why had the war started? What did each side actually want? What would it take for them to live in peace? She forced both commanders to confront the reality that neither could remember the original cause of the conflict, that both were fighting purely from momentum and pride and fear of what stopping might mean. On the 7th day, a fragile ceasefire was announced. It would take years to negotiate a permanent peace, decades to rebuild what had been destroyed, generations to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. But the killing stopped. The weapons fell silent. The dying ended. In the months that followed, humanity revealed some of what they had been doing during their 50 years of isolation. They had not regressed or stagnated. They had evolved, combining biological and artificial intelligence in ways that previous galactic law had forbidden. They had developed technologies that seemed to violate known physics. They had built a civilization based on principles that seemed impossible, where human and machine consciousness worked together as equals, where power was matched with wisdom, where capability was tempered with restraint. The Galactic Senate reformed with humans as mediators rather than members. The Terran Accord made it clear they had no interest in conquest or domination. They wanted only to ensure that the galaxy's civilizations did not destroy themselves in fits of madness, like the Dravok-Kelthrian War. They would watch, they would wait, and when necessary, they would intervene. Admiral Syrinx retired to a monastery on his homeworld, spending his remaining years in contemplation and attempting to write a true history of the war that would not glorify the senseless slaughter. Commander Velan became an ambassador for peace, traveling the galaxy to tell her story and warn others about how easily civilization could collapse into barbarism. And the horizon's edge returned to the darkness between stars, one ship among many in humanity's new fleet, watching over a galaxy that had learned that the greatest power was not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to choose mercy. They had ended a war not through overwhelming violence but through overwhelming competence, matched with overwhelming restraint. They had shown that sometimes the most terrifying force in the universe was not weapons or armies, but beings who possessed unlimited power and chose to use almost none of it. The galaxy would remember the day a lone human vessel entered the greatest battle in history and ended it without firing a single shot. They would remember, and they would be grateful. And somewhere in the void, Captain Elena Vasquez watched her sensors and waited for the next moment when wisdom and power might be needed to save civilization from itself once more. Retry. The arrival in the silence. The Epsilon Vardis system had once been beautiful. 3 habitable planets orbited a stable yellow star, their surfaces covered in sprawling cities and agricultural complexes that fed billions. Trade stations dotted the space between worlds, massive structures where merchants from across the galaxy had gathered to exchange goods and ideas. It had been a crossroads of civilization, a place where peace and prosperity seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. Now it was about to become a graveyard. Admiral Syrinx arrived first, his Dravok fleet emerging from faster-than-light travel in a perfectly synchronized formation that would have been impressive if anyone had been in the mood to appreciate military precision. 300 warships, from massive dreadnoughts to swift destroyers, took up positions around the primary planet. Behind them came support vessels, medical frigates, and engineering platforms. And hidden among the military formation, protected by layers of point defense systems, were the civilian evacuation transports. Those transports haunted Syrinx. There were 47 of them, packed with refugees who had been trying to flee the system before the battle began. They had been too slow or too unlucky, or perhaps just too poor to afford passage on faster ships. Now they were trapped, Civilian vessels caught between armies with nowhere to run. Both sides would claim they were trying to protect the refugees. Both sides would be lying. The transports were hostages, human shields, bargaining chips in negotiations that would never happen. Commander Valan's Kelthrian fleet arrived 6 hours later, their ships materializing in precise attack formations that spoke of years of brutal experience. She had 280 vessels, slightly fewer than Cyrix, but her ships were newer and her crews more desperate. The Kelthrian Union was losing the war slowly but inexorably, and everyone knew this battle might be their last chance to turn the tide. Desperation made people dangerous in ways that confidence never could. For 3 days, both fleets maneuvered around each other like dancers in some elaborate, deadly ballet. Destroyers probed for weaknesses, fighters conducted reconnaissance sweeps, and electronic warfare specialists tried to hack each other's communications. Small skirmishes erupted and were quickly suppressed. Neither commander wanted to begin the main battle until they were certain of advantage, and neither was willing to make the first move that might be perceived as weakness. On the 4th day, the situation deteriorated rapidly. A Dravok patrol encountered a Kelthrian supply convoy near the second planet. Shots were fired, and within minutes both sides were pouring reinforcements into what had been a minor incident. The skirmish grew into a battle. The battle grew into a full engagement. And suddenly the war everyone had been anticipating was underway, whether the commanders wanted it or not. Cyrix watched his tactical display with a sick feeling in his stomach. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. His communication console lit up with an encrypted message from Dravok High Command. The orders were simple and absolute. Deploy the quantum disruptor. Target the Kelthrian fleet. Leave no survivors. Win the war today, whatever the cost. Valan received similar orders from the Kelthrian Strategic Command. Use the planet killer weapons. Destroy the Dravok industrial capacity in this system. Accept the civilian casualties as necessary losses. End this war before the Union collapsed completely. Both commanders stared at their orders and felt the weight of history pressing down on them. They were not evil people. They had not wanted this war, had not chosen these weapons, had not sought the power to unmake entire populations with a single command. But history did not care about intentions or desires. History cared about actions, and in moments like these, the actions of individuals could shape the fate of civilizations. The battle intensified with horrifying speed. Energy weapons carved through armor plating, missiles streaked across the void seeking targets, and fighters dueled in close quarters, where reflexes meant the difference between life and death. Ships on both sides began to die, their crews screaming final messages that would never be heard, their reactors exploding in bursts of light that briefly outshone the system's star. The civilian transports, caught in the middle of the expanding battlefield, tried desperately to maneuver to safety, but they were slow, ungainly vessels designed for cargo, not combat. One took a hit from a stray missile and broke apart, spilling atmosphere and bodies into vacuum. Another was caught in the crossfire between 2 capital ships and simply disintegrated. The survivors broadcasted frantic pleas for mercy on every frequency, begging both sides to stop, to let them leave, to remember they were civilians who had nothing to do with this war. No one was listening. Or rather, everyone was listening, but no one could stop. The battle had achieved its own momentum, a terrible inertia that carried armies forward regardless of what individual soldiers or commanders wanted. War had become a machine that consumed lives and produced only corpses and hatred, and once started, it was almost impossible to shut down. Cyrix reached for the quantum disruptor controls. His hands were shaking. Valan prepared to authorize the planet killer strike. Her eyes were dry because she had stopped crying years ago. Both knew that in the next few minutes, they would become the greatest mass murderers in galactic history. Both knew that if they did not act, their own forces would be destroyed and millions would die anyway. Both knew there were no good choices left, only degrees of horror. That was when something impossible appeared on every sensor screen in both fleets simultaneously. At first, the sensor officers thought it was a malfunction or an enemy trick. The readings made no sense. A single contact appearing from nowhere, directly between the 2 warring fleets. No faster-than-light signature. No energy emissions consistent with known propulsion systems, just suddenly there as if it had been waiting invisibly for exactly this moment. The contact resolved into a ship, and experienced officers from both sides felt their breath catch in their throats. It was like nothing they had ever seen. The vessel was approximately 800 meters long, smaller than a dreadnought but larger than a cruiser. Its hull was a strange dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. It had no obvious weapons, no visible engines, no external structures that made sense according to conventional starship design. Most disturbing of all was the signature it broadcasted on all frequencies, in every major galactic language, clear and unmistakable. Terran vessel Horizon's Edge. Human ship. The announcement rippled through both fleets like electricity through water. Humans. The species that had vanished 50 years ago, that most people assumed were extinct or irrelevant, that had become little more than cautionary tales told to children. They were here now, in the middle of the largest battle of the war, in a ship that defied every known principle of starship engineering. Admiral Syrinx opened a communication channel to the strange vessel, his voice carrying decades of military authority. Unidentified human ship, you are in the middle of an active combat zone. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed as a combatant vessel. Commander Valen sent her own message, less threatening but equally firm. Human vessel, this is Commander Valen of the Kelthrian Union. We have no quarrel with your people, but this is a military engagement. For your own safety, please leave the system immediately. The response came after a long pause in a voice that was distinctly female and carried an accent that no living being had heard in half a century. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran Accord ship Horizon's Edge. We have been monitoring this conflict for 12 years. We are here to end it. Both fleets will cease fire immediately and withdraw to neutral positions. The sheer audacity of the statement left both commanders momentarily speechless. A single ship, from a civilization that had been absent from galactic affairs for 5 decades, ordering 2 of the most powerful military fleets in the galaxy to stand down. It would have been laughable if it were not so presumptuous. Syrinx recovered first. Captain Vasquez, with all respect to your people's past contributions to galactic civilization, you have no authority here. This is a matter between the Dravok Empire and the Kelthrian Union. Withdraw now or we cannot guarantee your safety. Valen was more direct. Human, one ship cannot stop a war between empires. Leave before you are caught in the crossfire. The Horizon's Edge remained motionless between the fleets, a dark spot against the stars that seemed to drink in light and offer nothing in return. Captain Vasquez's voice came again, and this time there was something in it that made experienced warriors feel cold despite themselves. You misunderstand. That was not a request. That was a warning. Cease fire and withdraw, or I will be forced to demonstrate why you should.